presentation, we're going to talk about anti-piracy in the cinema, and this is not about internet uploads and such. This is about how we look at anti-piracy on the first release. This is where it's not necessarily where it starts. It may even start pre-first release on the piracy side, but that's fairly under control today, as studios would tell you. First release is really where we're focused right now. And I try to show how, to get people to connect to what the problem is. I really like to show what the threat really is. Professionals. We're not talking about amateurs here. Actually, well, there are amateurs in this business, but we have professionals. This is with real rigs. So they strap cameras to themselves. They find ways to get quality copies. This picture is a real photo inside the theater. It's taken with the technology I'll talk about in a little bit, called Pirate Eye. This was taken in Puerto Rico. This was this fellow's last camcorder. He had been responsible for a lot of piracy. These people that you just saw are not the top dogs in this business on the anti-piracy side. It's really, they are the bottom line workers. They're the worker bees that are hired to go out and actually take these, pirate the copies from in the theaters. These folks are organized by large rings, large piracy rings, and whose monies have been made largely on the hard good side. But there's a lot of money in hard good delivery, and it's so good of a business, it's more lucrative than selling drugs. As you can see by the numbers here, more profitable than, or as profitable as cocaine, more profitable than heroin. And the upside of it is that there's no downside. You don't get the penalties that you do by handling drugs. So it's quite an interesting business to be in. Now we have other kinds of, other piracy doesn't just happen with just professionals here. We have casual piracy going on. Well, these are not professional pirates. But this was taken again with this technology that I'll talk about. But this was in an AMC theater in San Diego a few months back. And casual piracy is something that's starting to be looked at, because that kind of piracy leads to clips on social networking sites. Things get shared around family and friends, much more informally. And on a large-scale basis, that starts to have an impact. So some studios are actively taking looks at how do they address casual piracy down the road. Now, if you're a content owner, you have some choices, and this is the kinds of strategies that content owners have to look at. The first is that you need to enact laws. You need to be sure that you're covered on the legal side. And that might sound simple, but it's generally only illegal in English-speaking countries right now. I think the French have taken some steps on anti-piracy, possibly the Germans. And, but anti-piracy is not necessarily illegal in a good part of the world. Or, excuse me, I said anti-piracy. Piracy is not illegal in a good part of the world. And that's an issue that has to get dealt with, and it is being dealt with, but it's where a lot of energy goes today is trying just to enact laws. Once you enact laws, then you have to educate your law enforcement side that this is illegal. So that might take a year or two before you start really getting that effort out. In the United States, where there are largely laws to say that piracy is illegal, theater owners and managers still have to carry copies, are still encouraged to carry copies of the law with them, so that if they have to call a law enforcement official in, they can show them that it's within his duty to arrest this person. So there's a lot of challenges just in enacting laws. How we find pirates is through tracking theft, and marking the content is actively performed today. You mark film content before distribution, and that content gets marked individually so that the prints that appear at a particular location are unique. And if a piracy occurs at that location, it can then be traced and say, oh, that's where it took place. Now, the usefulness of this is that it helps law enforcement officials understand the patterns of piracy that take place. And through this kind of activity, by tracing piracy, one can then determine the next steps, where this pirate might hit next. And so it used to be that patterns of piracy would take place just within a city. And now they start taking place across regions of the country, and you can start predicting where the next hit might take place. And so the actual act of enforcement now occurs with organizations such as the MPAA, who has a very significant part of the MPAA is focused on enforcement activities. They're not looking for specifically trying to protect one particular movie. They're looking for the hardcore criminals who are responsible for camcorder theft. And so they rely on the marks, they rely on tracking those marks, and then they rely on predictions for where that piracy takes place. And this is a large department under Mike Robinson at the MPAA. Mike himself comes out of law enforcement. A good part of his staff, which is in places around the country, come out of the law enforcement area. This is a really highly professional group that's out looking for pirates. Another opportunity or a strategy in anti-piracy is to protect the content. That's where you're not necessarily looking for a particular pirate. You're just trying to find ways to foil piracy. Protection's a different kind of strategy. I'll talk a little bit about that. If you're a content owner, one of your strategies available is to simply do nothing. And this is sad but true. This is one of the strategies that you have, one of the things you might have to consider when you're budget strapped. All of these things go against a budget on distribution. So this is a consideration if you're a content owner, is to simply do absolutely nothing in regards to anti-piracy efforts. If you're a theater, you have some challenges. If you're trying to find, if you should happen to learn that there's somebody in your theater who has a camcorder, it can be challenging. In last December, we had a particular case occur where in a movie co in Chicago, one of the opportunities that this movie theater offers to parents is to rent the theater for birthday parties. So this family held a birthday party and a young woman was there, I think it was her niece, was filming this event or camcording this event on a digital camcorder. She happened to catch part of the process of, or the advantage of doing this in a movie theater is that everybody gets to see a movie after the party. And so this woman happened to catch a few minutes of the movie on her camcorder. Well, part of the policy of the theater is that they take a look at the camcorder and want to see what's on, make sure there's no movies content on it. Their policy said if there was movie content on the camcorder, that they call the cops. The cops came, the police came. They knew that it was their duty to arrest this person because the laws said that they needed to enforce those laws. This woman ended up for a couple nights in jail, and this was just a person who was trying to capture her niece on video during her birthday party and spent a couple nights in jail. It actually took the movie director to come out and drop charges against her. I point this out as saying this was everybody, is that everybody in the path of this unfortunate action did their job. And that's one of the challenges that we have actually in anti-piracy efforts, is that it doesn't always lead to the desired consequence. So there's a lot of challenges in policy enactment here. On the protection side, which is where one would say this is a different way to go. Instead of doing enforcement, which is the business of calling law enforcement officials, coming out and arresting somebody, another way of dealing with anti-piracy is simply say, I'll find ways to foil the pirate. And so in a sense, this is really the holy grail of anti-piracy efforts, is to find ways to jam or deface the camcording while it's in process, so that the content that's taken, that's stolen, is essentially useless and not highly marketable. So there's a science to this. There's lots of effort. No shortage of effort has gone into this at all. There's many patents around how to go into the jamming or enact jamming of camcorders, and they generally fall into these three categories that I show here. One's called temporal, where the technique is to project the image in ways such that the frame rate is changing. Instead of having a steady frame rate, the frame rate will change. With digital projections, this kinds of techniques are possible. What that does with the camcorders, it'll start getting roll bars going through the copy, because it can't lock into the frame rate and move with it fast enough. So that creates a defacing, for instance, of the camcording. A spatial temporal technique combines that with the ability to throw in a graphic or text, and so that as the camcording is getting foiled through some shifting of frame rates or something else, another mark is being inserted with it in order to upset or deface that image. And then what's called metameric is when you try and interfere through some other invisible type of electromagnetic radiation. So the classic case in that is where you bring in infrared light. You flood the auditorium with infrared light. That messes up the camcorder's ability to the autofocus element, and the shutter, not the shutter, but the light gathering ability of the camera is adjusted automatically. And this, by looking at the light, infrared light might very well upset that. Now, that might be true with an older camcorder. A newer camcorder, for instance, might have an infrared filter in it. So that becomes part of our problems here in trying to create jamming techniques, is that this is a very high bar to reach. There's a lot of problems in trying to create something that works on every camera and all the time. So I liken this to some of the work that took place about 10 years ago, 9 or 10 years back, in digital cinema. We were looking for an ideal compression on digital cinema, and this was related to image quality. And we have the same problems here. We're looking for image quality. We don't want to impact the quality of image that we see as theater goers, but we want to mess up the camcording. So it's quite a challenging thing. What we found on why I bring up the compression side is that there were all these different techniques in the compression world, and so we looked at all of these techniques to see which one could produce visually lossless, have images at very low bandwidths. And what we found is that by the time we got to visually lossless, they were all at the same bandwidth. They all had to reach the same bar in order to show that they were visually lossless. That was an indication that that plateau would just happen to be uniform. It was one of the most astonishing finds, I think, that ever came out of that whole study. It's a similar kind of problem in jamming. The bar, no matter what technique we try, by the time we reach this bar of not having noticeable jamming, or not having a noticeable impact on the image that the audience is looking at, and at the same time we have an unnoticeable element in the audience, but we have a very noticeable element going on inside the camcorder. By the time you create that dynamic on the image capture, you've created something that becomes visible in the auditorium. And so that, regardless of technique, this is what's been found. And this was through a lot of research by a couple of companies here in town. Some of it's been funded through Movie Labs, which was a joint effort of the studios to discover and fund camcording and anti-theft activities. So this jamming, as I show the picture here of, it's the holy grail. And it's a lot of money to be made if somebody can come up with a good anti-jamming, good anti-piracy technique through jamming, because it creates a non-invasive technique that would stop camcording in the theaters. But we have not really found that yet, and it's a sorry but true statement there. There's other solutions that are tried today in the theater space. You'll see particularly this takes place on pre-release screenings, the use of night vision goggles. You'll see somebody at each corner of the theater, or maybe just in one corner of the theater, a guard in place, have some goggles on and be looking. And as you saw from those earlier pictures, that poor guy is looking for a needle in a haystack. It's very difficult to spot a camcorder just with night vision goggles. It's very easy to spot somebody who's doing this. It's very difficult to spot somebody who's got it hidden under their arms, who's got some other technique hidden under coats or whatever technique they're using to cloak the camera. Very hard to find that camera. There's other techniques that have been tried as well. In the UK, a company introduced a way of identifying cameras through electromagnetic signatures. Each camera has some kind of gives off some sort of electromagnetic signature, and it was a very clever idea, except it requires an infinitely large database that you have to keep cataloging all these cameras as they come out. And naturally, when you put these techniques to work, you still find what kills these technologies is when somebody puts this to work and the camcording still takes place. And I believe that took place with that particular technique. So there has been a technique that has worked, and that's simply not jamming, but discovery of the camcorder, finding the camcorder in the audience. And so this technique has been brought to us by the same people who have brought sniper scope detection technology into the military. And the technique was originally developed by Apogen, a company down in San Diego. It is a very clever technology for identifying lenses. Not lenses as glasses, not other kinds of glass or reflective objects that might be in the auditorium, but it actually looks for a particular pattern of reflections that are unique inside of a camera lens. And this technique has been shown to actually work, and it works very well. The pictures you saw earlier and the captures that took place were all based upon the use of this technology. So Movie Labs, this organization that I described earlier that has been very responsible in finding and funding these kind of activities, these kind of technology developments, has put a lot of money behind this one, and it has blossomed into from what looked like a rocket science project 5-6 years ago into something that now looks like a real commercial product. We're getting down to the commercial product effort now. And enough units have been built that the MPAA has put them to work. And when you're in an enforcement activities, as I pointed out earlier, part of the job of enforcement activities is you find those patterns. You discover those patterns of where piracy is taking place. You're looking for where you're predicting where the next step will be. You want to put your people out there, but if your only tool is night vision goggles, it's tough. When you put something like this into place, you find them. And so this is actively going on today. There's a number of these units built. This is being installed in tactical ways, not fixed installments, but what I would call tactical employments. And what I like to say is that while some technologies require smoke and mirrors, this one is only mirrors. You just see the mirrors on this one that are used to scan audiences and do the things that this technology does. On this particular version of it that you see here is sitting on a stand. This is what you will see in a movie theater. They'll install it below the screen. You might not notice it going into the theater. You might not actually see it. But in where they have this predictive or are predicting that a piracy may take place, or where patterns of activity shows that piracy tends to take place in one particular location, they'll install these and sit and wait. What this technology can do, how this works, is that it's still a little interactive. It does a lot of work on its own in determining determining a real lens. So if you have a camera and it's pointed at the screen, this technology will find you. It doesn't matter how you've cloaked it, how you've hidden it, whatever. If it's capturing that screen, it will find you. And it will take your picture, it will show where you're located, and it can send an email to the theater employees. And this is what the emails look like. This is actually taken from a real email, and this was a real capture. I think this guy was stealing the Michael Jackson movie. And, fairly recent. And this is the kind of information that the employee gets. So now they know, this is where we get back to interaction. The employee has to go into the theater. They know the general area where this person is. You can see on the top map, that's a seating area. And the red spot says, this is where you're going to find the guy. And so they can go in, look for this person who looks like this picture, and ask him to step out of the theater. So that goes back to those policy challenges now and such that theater owners face. But this is the only technique that's been found to actually work to find pirates today. So this technique is probably still a year or two away from actually getting exploited widely into theaters. There's still work to be done to bring the cost down to a point where it can be scaled out widely, but there's a lot of work going on towards that direction and bringing it out. And there may be a day where we see these things mounted above screens on first release auditoriums, for instance, and just looking for pirates. So just to wrap up here, the three things that I really wanted to get across was that the actual effort that a content owner has to put in depends upon their strategies around and how they're going to apply their budget. So there's they have the choices of enforcement activities or protection activities, doing nothing. They might just, the studio content owner might just put all their efforts directed towards just enacting laws in other countries, just as a first step. But this is the kind of things that one has to make a choice of when you are a studio. On the jamming side, while it's the most ideal way we could sit and find to stop camcorder piracy, it is a very tough thing to do. And an ideal technique has not been found yet. Camcorder detection is really the only thing that we found has worked, and that's the pirate eye technology I just showed you.